Now I'd like to draw your attention to the illustration in panel A. So here in panel A we have a view of the cerebellum as if it were possible to remove the cortex from the cerebellum and flatten it out. If we were to do so, we would find a convenient way to recognize three major functional subdivisions of the cerebellum that we want to discuss. Now, there are many different ways to divide the cerebellum. One could take an anatomical approach. I'm choosing to take for you a functional approach. And with this in mind, we would define a spinal cerebellum. The spinal cerebellum includes essentially a medial strip of cerebellar cortex that spans what we call the two cerebellar hemispheres and includes the continuity of those hemispheres along the midline region here, which has a memorable name. This is called the vermis, which is Latin for worm. It's as if we're looking down on a segmented worm. Unlike the hemispheres of the cerebrum, there really is no separation of the gray matter here between the cerebellar hemispheres. Rather, there's continuity. So this spinal cerebellum really is the central region along the midline and the parasagittal regions of the cerebellar hemispheres. And we call it the spinal cerebellum because this is the part of the cerebellum that is mostly concerned with the movements of the arms and the legs. It is receiving input from the spinal cord. Now there's also some representation of cranial movement here in the spinal cerebellum. So let's not let that fact deter us from calling this the spinal cerebellum. The next component is this very large cerebrocerebellum. And this is what comprises most of the cerebellum that we observe when we look at the human cerebellum. We have these very large, very extensive lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum, much larger than any non-primate mammal and perhaps even as large or larger than any other of the primates. So this is the part of the cerebellum that is involved with circuitry from the cerebral cortex that returns a signal back to circuitry of the cerebral cortex. Hence its name Cerebrocerebellum. We'll say more about the functions of this division of the cerebellum in the third part. For now, suffice it to say that the cerebrocerebellum is concerned with the skilled movements that we perform with our distal extremities, especially when then there's some kind of skill that is being executed according to some goal-directed motor plan. And then the third component of the cerebellum that I would mention pertains to this little structure that is tucked away under the ventral and anterior aspect of the posterior cerebellum. This is called the vestibulocerebellum. And this term vestibulocerebellum is a functional term. Anatomically, it relates to these two parts of the cerebellum that we call the flocculus and the nodulus, and together we call this the floccular nodular lobe. So the vestibulocerebellum is the floccular nodular lobe, and this is the part of the cerebellum that is intimately connected with the vestibular nuclei of the dorsolateral tegmentum in the upper medulla and the caudal pons. So this part of the cerebellum is going to have much to do with calibrating and governing the motor output from our vestibular nuclei. Let me just show you a bit more closely these functional divisions with a special attention now given to the organization of the representation of the body in the spinal cerebellum. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the spinal cerebellum refers to this central strip of cerebellar cortex that includes the vermis right along the mid-sagittal plane and a paramedian strip extending out maybe a centimeter or so from that vermis. And here we have a map of the body. And this body map is not a single smooth continuous map, but it's fractionated in a way that's not unlike the mapping of motor intention in the motor cortex is fractionated. In fact, we have multiple representations that are present here, and this is a very simplified view and undoubtedly an incorrect view with respect to many of its details, but it conveys a sense of the organization of the representation of movement in the spinal cerebellum. And what I would especially highlight is the fact that the axial representation is closer to the middle of the spinal cerebellum along the region of the vermis, whereas the representation of the distal extremities extends outward from the vermis into this paramedian strip of cerebellar cortex that begins to extend into the lateral hemispheres. Now, as I mentioned, there are two levels of processing with respect to the gray matter of the cerebellum. There is the cortex, and then there's the deep nuclei. So the cortex is what we see from the outside when we look at these massive cerebellar hemispheres. And this cortex is folded into these tight little mini convolutions. Now in the cerebrum we call these gyri, and the spaces between them we call these sulci. In the cerebellum we call these folia, because if one were to look in cross-section at this cortex, what one would see is a nice delicate extension of processes, almost like leaves on a tree. So folia implies leaf, and what we see in the cortex of the cerebellum looks more like leaves than it does a large massive gyrus. Now what I would also point out about these folia is that they extend over quite a considerable distance. One can follow the same fold across the cerebellar hemisphere for at least several centimeters, perhaps even through the spinal cerebellum, across the vermis, and into the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. So when we talk about the circuitry in detail, we'll see what accounts for this organization of these folia that extends across the long axis of the brainstem in this way. Now below the cortex there are the deep nuclei, and the deep nuclei are the structures that are highlighted here. They actually reside in the white matter just on top of the roof of the fourth ventricle. There's a very large structure that resembles sort of a row of molar teeth, and because of its resemblance to dentition, this nucleus is called the dentate nucleus. That's by far the largest of our deep cerebellar nuclei, and it's a nucleus that seems to be mainly related to the cerebrocerebellum. Right next to the dentate nucleus are at least a pair of nuclei, sometimes more depending on how you subdivide. These are called the interposed nuclei, and these nuclei pertain mainly to the lateral aspects of the spinal cerebellum. And then most medially there is a small nucleus called the vestigial nucleus, and this nucleus pertains mainly to the vermis, or the medial region of the spinal cerebellum, and it's found appropriately on the medial side of this cluster of nuclei. Now you may be wondering about a deep nucleus for the vestibulocerebellum. As I'll mention, the deep nuclei of the vestibulocerebellum are actually the vestibular nuclei of the brainstem. So from this standpoint, we can consider the vestibular nuclear complex as deep cerebellar nuclei that are displaced out of the cerebellum and into the brainstem. Well, you'll understand the anatomical relationships between cortex and deep nuclei as we get into part 2 of this tutorial. At this point, I actually want to show you a bit of histology. So this is a transverse section through the brainstem, and our inset below hopefully orients you to what you're looking at. We're seeing a cross-section through the caudal part of the pons that extends through the fourth ventricle and into the cerebellum. And what I want to highlight for you is this beautiful dentate nucleus. And hopefully you can imagine why the early anatomists called it a dentate structure, given the resemblance, at least in your imagination perhaps, to a row of teeth. So that would be the dentate nucleus. It looks like we have elements of our interposed nuclei here, and then this is our vestigial nucleus. So these are the nuclei that are arranged in the base of the cerebellum in the white matter on the dorsal and lateral aspects of the fourth ventricle. Now I'll just caution you, if you look carefully at this dentate nucleus, You may think that you've seen something like that before if you've perused through sections of the brainstem in the medulla. This dentate nucleus visually resembles the inferior olivary nucleus. We'll talk about the inferior olivary nucleus in just a little while. So I don't want you to confuse the two. Even though they look similar, we know that this is the dentate nucleus because it is in the cerebellum, right? It's in the white matter at the base of the cerebellum. It's dorsal and lateral to the fourth ventricle, whereas the inferior olivary nucleus is in the anterior aspect of the brainstem in the medulla, which is a few centimeters in the inferior direction to where this section has been taken. Well, let me show you one other view of this system. This is from a rather unique section prepared by one of our histologists from a generation ago here at Duke. This is a section taken parallel to the long axis of the brainstem, and it happens to catch the base of the cerebellum as it's connecting to the brainstem. So this is a myelin stain, as was the previous image. So the white matter is going to be dark and the gray matter is going to be light. And what we see is the cerebellum out in this region of the image. So we have a cerebellar cortex and white matter underneath, and then now here's our beautiful dentate nucleus. Very rich, robust dentate nucleus as seen in this section. And we'll come back to this, but I'll just highlight for you this white matter that's streaming out of the dentate nucleus. These are axons that are going to be forming the superior cerebellar peduncle. And what these axons do is they stream out of the dentate nucleus, they run through that peduncle into the pons, they cross the midline, and then they synapse in targets in the thalamus and in the brainstem. So more on that when we talk about the outputs of the deep cerebellar nuclei. Okay, we've concluded our introduction to the basic parts of the cerebellum. When we come back, we'll take a closer look at cerebellar circuits.